Chapter 1384. As soon as I arrived at the office door, I just ran into my childhood friend Linda coming out of the office. When she saw Alex, she said happily, "Alex, why are you here?" Alex smiled slightly and said, "I have something to find Mrs. Brown. Is she there?" "It's here." Linda smiled, and hugged Alex's arm when he came up, and said affectionately, "Alex, you haven't come here these days. I miss you." Alex smiled and said, "Why don't you just call me?" "I'm afraid you are busy," Linda said delicately. "I don't want to delay your business." Alex said, "Okay, I will invite you to dinner the next day, and you can go ahead if you have anything to do. I will go in and find Mrs. Brown." Linda said, "Okay, Alex, you go to Mrs. Brown first. I will go to the back kitchen to see if the children's dinner has started. Don't rush away later. I will come to you when I'm done." "It is good." After Linda left, Alex just knocked on the door, and Mrs. Brown's kind voice came from inside. "It's Alex, right? Come in." Alex opened the door and saw Mrs. Brown sitting at a simple desk, looking through a pile of documents. Mrs. Brown raised her head to look at him, pushed her glasses, and asked with a smile, "Why are you here? You didn't say a word before you came." Alex smiled unnaturally. "Mrs. Brown, I am looking for you. I want to ask you something." Mrs. Brown nodded and said with a smile, "What are you polite to Auntie? Just say it." Alex walked to Mrs. Brown, sat down on the chair opposite her desk, looked at Mrs. Brown, hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Mrs. Brown, I came to you to ask you back then some details that took me into the orphanage." Mrs. Brown's expression flashed with a slight astonishment, but she quickly returned to business as usual. She smiled and said, "It's been more than 10 years, and Auntie may not remember many details, but you can just ask her if she knows. I will tell you." Alex is not a fool, and the subtle changes in Mrs. Brown's expression have not been ignored by him. On the contrary, he saw some problems from the slight changes. If Mrs. Brown had nothing to hide from herself, she shouldn't have that expression at all. She must have something in her heart, so that it would appear unnatural on the surface. So he looked at Mrs. Brown and asked seriously, "In fact, I want to know, after I came to the orphanage, has anyone come to the orphanage to look for me in the 10 years before I left?" Mrs. Brown said without hesitation, "No, never." Alex frowned and asked, "Is there really no one?" Mrs. Brown said confidently, "Really not." "That's not right." Alex looked at Mrs. Brown, couldn't help but sighed, and said with emotion, "Mrs. Brown, I am the one you saw when you were a child. I will always remember this kindness, so in front of you, I too am not going to lie. I'll tell you what I have." When Alex said this, Mrs. Brown's expression became a little flustered. She realized that Alex should have known something this time. However, she didn't dare to say anything, so she was extremely nervous. Alex continued to say at this time, "Mrs. Brown, I heard that the best friend of my father had come to Orris Hill many times to find me, and he also came to our Orris Hill Welfare Institute more than once."